So really just picking up directly where Mike left off, part of the composition of this whole discussion today is addressing the whole situation around the so-called climate change summit occurring in Paris just starting next week. And I'm just going to say a little bit, and then we're going to have an important discussion of the actual science underlying the issue, but I wanted just to situate the discussion really in what Mike just went through. This is really part of the same issue. And to highlight this, we recently have emphatically supported a call and echoed a call put out by a couple leading activists who are opposing the idea that there's some imminent catastrophe coming from human carbon emissions. These individuals have put out a call saying, if we're serious about actually defending human life, if we're worried about the effects of climate on people's living conditions, people's well-being, then this whole Paris conference should be dedicated to what are we going to do about these millions of refugees fleeing the effects of Obama's wars in northern Africa and the Middle East, fleeing into Europe where it's now entering the winter. And we could be looking at a situation where many thousands of people could be facing horrific conditions if they're not provided adequate housing, warmth, if they're not provided the adequate shelter they need to support the conditions of life of all these refugees. But that's not going to be taken up at this Paris climate conference. What's going to be discussed is hypothetical scenarios of how the climate might cause harm to people decades into the future. I think that's just a useful irony to underscore, and Mike touched upon this a little bit, which is the real motivation behind this climate change conference in Paris. This is part of a whole sequence of moves supporting the idea that we need to take action to reduce human carbon emissions. What we have covered in the special report that Bob mentioned at the beginning, and I believe there's copies there at the event for people to pick up. Global warming is population reduction, not science. And to people is that the real underlying ideology behind this entire fraud is a Malthusian ideology. It's an ideology, it's a modern manifestation of the ideology of Thomas Malthus. The idea that mankind is already rapidly outpacing the carrying capacity of the planet, and that we need to immediately limit human population growth, limit economic development, suppress economic development, reduce population, and there's an active push to do that. And that's what that's the real issue underlying this whole climate change issue. And what we cover in the report, I'm not going to go through all the details. I kind of want to just give a sense to situate it. And people really need to pick up this report and study it. What we show in there is that this is, the root of this is absolutely clearly solidified in this Malthusian outlook. And if you take, for example, just to highlight probably one of the leading organizations and the leading people promoting this thing, a lot of this centers directly around the British royal family and the British establishment surrounding the British royal family. And if you take, for example, one of their leading institutions, one of the leading forefront institutions pushing this scare of a man-made climate change crisis, this fraudulent scare of a man-made climate change catastrophe. Look at the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, one of the leading so-called environmentalist organizations founded in the 1960s, one of the most well-funded, incredibly active currently in the push for this Paris Climate Summit and this push for a reduction of human carbon emissions. So take that as a leading example of the type of thing we're talking about. where did the World Wildlife Fund come from? Well, three of the leading individuals that founded this give you a very clear sense of what we're dealing with. You had Sir Julian Huxley, a rabid proponent of eugenics, a major proponent of eugenics before World War II, and continued to be a proponent of eugenics after World War II. So even after the world had been exposed to the horrors of what Hitler had done, Julian Huxley, only a few years after the conclusion of World War II, actually residing as the head of the United Nations, the UNESCO organization, actually advocated a return to the investigations of eugenics, race science, the idea that the whole race science ideology that Hitler obviously was a proponent of. Julian Huxley continued to promote these ideas. He was the head of what was known as the British Eugenics Society all the way up into the early 1950s. He was one of the leading founders of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. He collaborated with another royal of Europe, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who was directly involved with the Nazi movement. He was actually part of Nazi intelligence. He worked for IG Farben as part of the Nazi SS intelligence operations in the early 30s. After the war had ended, Prince Bernhard has been accused of using his position as the head of Royal Dutch Airlines at the time to fly Nazi war criminals out of Europe secretly down into South America and other locations. So he continued this type of activity after the war. He was another key founder of the World Wildlife Fund in collaboration with Julian Huxley. The third individual I'm going to highlight, Prince Philip, is one who unfortunately is still around today, the royal consort to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen of England. He, together with Julian Huxley and Prince Bernhard, came together to found this World Wildlife Fund organization. So these are people who are proponents of race science, eugenics, part of Nazi intelligence operations, and outright Malthusian thinkers who really got this whole so-called environmentalist movement going. At that phase was more often referred to as conservationism. You know, Prince Philip is famous, infamous, for having repeatedly stated that if he could be reincarnated as anything, he would like to come back as a deadly virus to help reduce the world population. He's spoken of the need to kill off sections of the human population the same way you do it for animals. These are things he's spoken openly. So it's this rabid Malthusian ideology, which is the real core root of what we're now seeing expressed as this call for a reduction of human greenhouse gases, the CO2 reduction scheme. This is not coming from a motivation based upon scientific grounds. And if people think this is purely a scientific debate centered around scientific arguments, they're not going to understand the real issue. There's a very active faction, directly connected with what Mike just discussed in terms of the overall strategic picture. These people believe that the world is vastly overpopulated. They believe that the world population needs to be reduced on the order of billions of people. Different estimates have been thrown out: 1 billion, less than 1 billion, 2 billion. That's the type of range these people think the world population should be capped at. And the vast majority of those people would not be having high living standards. And so that's the ideological motivation behind this claim that human energy production, the release of carbon dioxide, must be stopped immediately, that we need legally binding, we need a new legally binding treaty to enforce this fraud on the world, on nations, to ensure that developed nations reduce their development, reduce their energy consumption, reduce their living standards, and ensure that developing nations are not allowed to develop. This is the ideological framework underlying the thing. And again, we present this in much more detail in this report. This is really a must-read for everybody involved in these issues. This is a life or death issue for literally billions of people. And just before we get into some, we want to make sure this is stated very clearly up front, because this is the broader context. If we don't understand this, we're not going to really understand the motivation, the drive, pushing things like the Paris Climate Summit and related events. But before we get into a discussion of the actual science of the matter, I just want to underscore the flip side, the real issue, because Thomas Malthus was wrong. Prince Philip is wrong. These people that think the Earth's carrying capacity for human beings is 1 billion people are wrong. They think that mankind is just another animal on this planet, just another beast. And they think that mankind needs to be managed the same way you manage cattle or sheep or chickens. That's their ideology. That's how they think. That's their outlook. It's this old oligarchical mindset. In classical Western literature, this is the image of the god Zeus, the way Zeus treated mankind under his outlook. That's a very clear expression of this ideology. But it's wrong. It's not true. Thomas Malthus said that we would have overpassed the carrying capacity, hundreds of years ago. Yet we're way beyond that. The reality is that mankind is not just an animal species. The scientific reality is that for mankind, there's not a finite carrying capacity on the planet. There's not a finite amount of wealth on the planet, let alone on the planet. Mankind creates resources. Mankind creates wealth. Mankind creates value. He doesn't find it. There's not a limited amount of stuff for mankind to find, and once we find it all, that's it. Mankind creates. It's the discoveries of the human mind that transform the level of existence of the human species. That's what makes mankind a single, unique species on this planet. That's what these guys don't understand. That with the capabilities of scientific, technological advance, we have no problems supporting a much larger population at higher living standards. Mankind can do that. That's available to us if we pursue our true nature as a creative species and not let ourselves be held back by this old, degenerate, oligarchical mindset typified by the British royal family and all their agents of influence who are being used to try and ram this Paris Climate Summit down the throat of the world. I think just to tie this into the earlier discussion, this is recognized internationally in what China is doing. The president, Xi Jinping's policy in China, he's openly stated is a policy that he calls win-win cooperation. It's an idea that if nations and peoples and cultures actually engage in a creative, constructive collaboration in pursuit of development, we actually create a net increase in the total amount of wealth and resources and value available to mankind. That is reality. That's what's true for mankind. that when we pursue collaboration, scientific development, scientific discovery, we move the human species forward in qualitative leaps to new levels of existence. We haven't even scratched the surface of the capabilities provided by nuclear power, by fission power, by fusion power. There's going to be more discoveries beyond that will raise mankind to even higher levels. So this idea that the world can only support 1 billion people, this idea that mankind needs to be managed the way you'd manage a herd of cattle or something, is an ancient idea, a relic of, you need to just move beyond at this point. We need to leave this in the past, the way we left feudal societies and other old forms of degenerate control over societies in the past. We need to move beyond this. And that is really the substance of the issue being discussed in Paris, underlying this whole push for a attempt to limit carbon dioxide emissions. It's the same thing. You cannot support a world population on these green technologies, wind, solar, geothermal power. You simply can't do it. What's being pushed under the guise of this carbon reduction, green energy, getting away from fossil fuels is a population reduction program. They call it carbon dioxide. It's really about population. It's about development. And so this must be opposed. This must be shut down. This must be stopped, because this is the real ideology behind it. And instead, we have to pursue, what we're talking about here, mankind following his true creative nature, creating new resource bases, creating new levels of wealth, creating new value through international cooperation and development in this direction. And again, we cover this in more detail in the report, but I wanted to just put that on the table as the broader context before we get into what I think is going to be a very important presentation by Dr. Jan Weiser. Given the nature of this Paris Climate Summit, given the nature of what's being pushed for this carbon reduction scheme, we're very happy to have Dr. Weiser here to actually have a discussion of the real science, what's known about the role of carbon dioxide, CO2, in the Earth's climate system, in the Earth system. This is going to be important to actually clarify the real science from the top-down propaganda that is continually presented and rammed down people's throats. But just to introduce Dr. Weiser, he's certainly a very well-established scientist and professor. He's a distinguished professor at the University of Ottawa. He held the NSERC/NORADA/CAIR Chair of Earth Systems. From 1992 to 2004, he was the director of the Earth Systems Evolution Program for the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. He has multiple doctorates in sedimentology, geology, isotope geology, and he's received a number of rather prestigious awards in various nations for his scientific work over the past decades. And he's dedicated some of his time in recent years to developing an in-depth understanding and knowledge of the real relation between carbon dioxide, greenhouse emissions, and the Earth's climate system, including the role of water in the Earth's climate system. And so I know he has a presentation for us, which is going to, I think, be very valuable to illustrating the real science underlying carbon dioxide. And, this is the type of thing that people need to know going into this Paris Climate Summit so they're not duped by this massive level of propaganda. So I think, Bob, if you're ready there to set up the slides, I think we can go to Dr. Weiser.